Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm Jason Kawa. I'm the director of the Lampert Institute for Civic and Global Affairs, and I'm really pleased to be introducing our third speaker in our food series this year. Today's speaker is being sponsored by the Lampert Institute and also by the Woke Fund. So I'd like to thank both organizations for making this possible. Now, our speaker today is Kathleen Hefferon, and she received her PhD from the University of Toronto from the Department of Molecular Biophysics in the Faculty of Medicine. She is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Boyce Thompson Institute for Research at Cornell University and has been on faculty previously at Cornell University's Division of Nutritional Science and more recently at Cornell's Department of Food Science. Kathleen is the author and editor of a number of books, including Let Thy Food Be Thy Medicine, Plants in Modern Medicine, and her recently edited volume, Plant-Derived Pharmaceuticals, Principles and Applications for Developing Countries. More generally, she has written extensively on the field of plant-derived pharmaceuticals. Kathleen's research interests focus on the application of agricultural biotechnology to improve global health. And today she will be speaking to us on agricultural biotechnology and the challenge of global food security. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathleen Hefferon.
Okay. Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. And I just need to acquaint myself right now with... do we have... Is this a pointer? No. Oh, sorry. It's a microphone. I don't need a pointer. It's okay if we don't have one. Don't worry. Okay. So, how many of you are in science, are taking some sort of science degree? So quite a few. That's really great. It makes my job a little easier. I was mentioning earlier that if you feel you're confused about some of the techniques or information I'm providing, just feel free to wave your hand and say, hey, I don't understand, and I'll go over it. But I'm intending this to be quite basic, so it shouldn't be too much of a shock for you. So this is what I'm going to speak about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of world hunger and malnutrition. Then I'm going to talk a bit about what is agricultural biotechnology and provide you with some examples. Then discuss, can biotechnology address food security? And then I'll finish with a discussion of public perception, policy, and international trade concerning GM crops. So I'll start with this slide. This slide comes from Ronnie Kaufman, who's the director of international studies at Cornell University. And he got it from somebody else, actually. Listed up here, somebody from the U.S. Department of States. But he's presented this in a few talks, and I asked to borrow the slide because it really hit home to me. When I first looked at it, I thought, oh, we're looking at the solar system here, and that big red ball or orange ball is the sun. But this is really giving you a good perception of what the world faces today, what the human population faces. So this huge orange ball over here, will that come out? Yes, is hunger and malnutrition in the world today, 2015. And then if you look over here, we have some diseases that we've all heard about, tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS. Here's diabetes. And then further along, we have earthquakes and tsunamis. And so it just really brings home the idea that look, a tsunami might be in the news, and certainly there are road accidents, and this is an issue as well. But look at hunger and malnutrition in the world today. It's just giant, and it kind of gets forgotten by the wayside because it's been around us for so long. So there is some good news, though. This is the latest data about global poverty and hunger. And you can see here that on all of these countries, as of 2015, they've all reduced their amount of poverty. So hard poverty is living on less than $1.25 a day. And that's, hard to imagine. But here you can see that developing countries have definitely reduced the number of poor people in the world. Here's South Asia. I'm thinking in terms of India, East Asia, Pacific. I'm thinking of Indonesia, Malaysia, places like this. It's come down, also China. It's come down sharply because of China. China has risen in its wealth. The people are wealthier in that country. Sub-Saharan Africa is certainly decreasing, but not nearly enough. And here were our, Millennium Goals, and we didn't quite reach them, but we were in the right direction, put it that way. This is also somewhat good news. Here's global hunger. And you can see this is for the world, and we're looking at 2000 to, that's 1990 to 2015. And you can see, again, for each of these portions of the world, that we're having a reduction of hunger. And it's measured by the mortality rate of children under 5 and wasting and stunting and how many people are undernourished. And you can see, again, that Africa and South Asia are kind of at the top, so work needs to be done with these countries. And we have an institute director for South Asia programs at Cornell, who said still in India, even though we think of it as a more of a up-and-coming country, there's still 40% malnourishment in children, and I think it's 67% anemia in young mothers. So it's still, work needs to be done in these countries. So, and this is just showing really the same data, but a different way. And here you can see where all the problems for hunger are taking place. It seems that Africa and South Asia and some of Southeast Asia are the places where most hunger is found today. And of course, we're still going through a population boom, and it's predicted that we might have 9 or 10 billion people in the world by the year 2050. And so really to deal with this many people, we're going to have to double the amount of agricultural production we have today. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the worries of climate change. And this is just one example here. This comes from the EPA, so government. And these are areas in the world of high risk for drought, for example. And so these are areas that are predicted to be facing drought by the end of the century. So there's some concern, certainly, for how we're going to feed people. And this just came out about a month ago. This is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for the coming, I guess, 15 years. And you can see that number 1 is to have no poverty, to eliminate those very poor people living, or the number of poor people living under $1.25 a day. Number 2 is to eliminate hunger. And I asked, actually, one of the nutritional sciences professors, he's quite well known, Per Pinstrup Adamson. He actually won the World Food Prize a few years ago. Why would we put poverty first and why not hunger first? And he says, well, it seems that people can subsist on only rice or only maize or whatever, but they don't get these micronutrients, and they can't diversify their diet to be truly healthy. So if we can put some money in their pockets, the first thing they'll do once their tummy is full is they'll go and they'll diversify their diets and buy fruits and vegetables, and then their nourishment will be complete. So this is the way that seems to work, and this is the way the goals have been set up. So I think there's 17 goals, and 17 targets, and each of them has a whole series of sub-targets, and you can look this up if you like. So how does agriculture differ between wealthy industrialized countries and poor developing countries? And in a number of ways. Here we're looking at farming. On the left, we have a picture from the USDA, and I think this fellow might be putting insecticide or doing adding some kind of farming input onto his fields. And he's got these nice even fields. On the right-hand side, we have some ladies. You can see some of them have babies on their backs, and they're actually picking insects off their crops. So they don't have these fancy machinery, and they don't have this sort of thing to work with. So this is how they go about their farming. And again, as far as irrigation is concerned, here on the top, I think all of us have driven by massive, long irrigation systems such as this. And meanwhile, on the bottom here, we have people in Africa, and most people living in poverty don't have irrigation systems at all. They have rain-fed agriculture, and so they have to work to make sure that the water that falls gets to all the plants and nourishes their crops. And again, this is kind of the progression of agriculture, and you can see a similarity even. This is a picture from the 1930s in the US, and here we have India today. So they have bullocks and we have horses, and now we have these massive machines that can just, collect amazing amounts of crops in huge fields, and we're able to probably generate 10 times as much as in crops as some of the poor in rural communities. So now, what is agricultural biotechnology, and how can it help address food security? So I've stated it this way. I think there's probably several ways you can mention this, but it really is the use of DNA technologies to improve crops and livestock that were not possible with conventional breeding alone. And I've kind of divided this into two different groups. So here we have molecular plant breeding, which is one way to use agricultural biotechnology. And we basically make better traits and faster. It's a lot quicker than the way we used to do things. On this side, we have recombinant DNA technology, where we can actually put brand new traits into plants. And this is what we talk about when we say genetic engineering. So for those of you who kind of haven't thought about genetics for a little while, I've drawn this as kind of this beads on a string. And these are supposed to be, each of these circles is supposed to be a gene. So the genes are all together on a string, and this is a strand of DNA. So in conventional plant breeding, we have crossing between two different plants. These are two different genomes, and we get a mixture. And so we have an assortment of genes from both parents, and that's the way crop breeding has gone for millennia. It's difficult to sort out desired traits from undesired traits. Nowadays, we can use this molecular or marker-assisted selection, which is a type of molecular plant breeding. And here we can actually flag or mark the flanking regions to the gene of interest that we want. We would know the genome, we would have the genome sequenced of the plant, and then we can select for those markers and make sure that the seeds that we collect have these markers on them. And it's very fast in comparison than the old way we used to do things. And this, I think this is a very nice summary. This comes from the New York Times magazine, I think it was last year. But here, this is marker-assisted breeding. And so you can see here a parent plant will produce a certain number of progeny, and some of them will have the sequence that is beside the gene of interest we would like. We can then cross these plants and collect even more. And here we can collect the seeds and just chip them. Just take a small piece and sequence this chip and find out if the gene we want is there. So instead of planting 1,000 seeds and growing them all up and looking for the traits we want and then deciding I'll take these plants and recrossing them and this sort of thing, we can find out in a day. Here's the ones we want. These are the ones we're going to work with. And so we're almost skipping a whole step, and it's very fast, and we can get things done. So it's very useful. So the other type that we're going to spend a lot more time on today is genetic engineering, or making transgenic plants. And in this case, I've just drawn it as, here is a new gene that we would like to add to our regular genome, and here it is, we just add it. So all the traits and all the genes we want to keep are still there. We've just added a new gene that we would like to be in there as well. And has anyone here heard of mutagenesis breeding? Okay, one person, that's good to hear. But this is another type of breeding that isn't making a transgenic plant. But what happens here, and this has been around since I think the 40s, is this is a site where something radioactive is placed in the center. Could be cadmium or something like this. And then plants are placed around here, and they're exposed to radiation. We can also do this with chemical mutagens. And the plants are mutagenized in such a way that they produce new traits. So some of them lose their vigor, they don't grow very well, but others produce fancy new traits that we might like to use in agriculture. And this is the way new traits were added to in agriculture for many years. And these are examples I've shown here. This is ruby red grapefruit, which probably everyone has seen or eaten. And this one is a single malt Scotch. So the barley has been mutagenized. And there's kind of a running joke at Cornell that mutagenesis breeding is not considered a GMO because some people who don't like GMOs would be banned from having their single malt Scotch. So it's just a little joke. But this is a program, and there's a whole database, and I think there's probably a couple thousand different crops that you can go out to Wegmans or what have you and buy, and this is how they were produced. So now, genetic modification of crop plants. I'm guessing that most of you have seen a slide something like this, where we have cells that are transformed and regenerated into transgenic plants. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I've kind of distinguished between different types of transgenic crops that are up and coming and out there right now. So we have transgenic plants, we have something we're calling cisgenic plants, we have something known as RNA interference, and then we have genome editing, which is our brand new fun and great technology. So transgenic plants, this is the one where you're taking genes from another species and you're putting it into a certain crop. And a great example of this, I think, is golden rice. So golden rice, in this case, they've taken genes from daffodils, and this is a bacteria, and they've inserted them into rice. And the rice now produces beta-carotene, which gives it that yellow color. And this can be converted by the body into vitamin A. So it's very useful for those who have vitamin A deficiency. So this is an example of a cisgenic plant. So here we had a chestnut blight. So we had American chestnut trees which died all over in the forests in the Northeast, as far as I know. And here's a couple of guys from Syracuse University, and they went ahead and found a chestnut, I think it's an Asian chestnut, which does not, it seems to have a resistance to chestnut blight. So they were able to identify the gene that gave it this other chestnut tree, the resistance, and instead of trying to even cross these trees and waiting hundreds of years to develop new chestnut trees with the right trait, they've cloned these in using transgenic technology. And so now they've got here a small forest. They're doing field studies on providing, they may be able to reintroduce American chestnut back into the wild. That's something that is would be certainly interesting. It would be something to be discussed as well, I think. So RNA interference was another technology I mentioned. In this case, here's DNA, and here's DNA is transcribed into RNA, and RNA is translated into proteins. Well, if we can block RNA so that protein synthesis doesn't take place, then we can block certain genes, and that can be useful for crop production. So a great example you may have heard of in the news is Arctic apples. This is Neil Carter's Okanagan Biotechnology. And here the apples do not brown. So he's used RNA interference, and these are transgenic apples, and they're no longer able, once exposed to oxygen, to brown. Another technology you may have heard of is genetically engineered papayas, which are resistant to ring spot virus. This is a technology from Dennis Gonzalez, and it was originally worked on at Cornell University. But the Hawaiians lost most of their papaya crop, and it was going downhill, and he developed this type of papaya which became resistant to the virus. And then finally, genome editing, and I know this is kind of a bit of an overly scientific slide, but I just want to bring home, for those of you who don't want to look at fancy crystal structures or computational models of proteins, imagine a typewriter, if you can imagine what a typewriter is. I know that's a long time ago. And then there was some tape that you could buy. It was like a whiteout correction tape. So you could tap away on your typewriter, and then if you made a mistake, you could actually put a piece of this tape in, and it would block out the letter, your typo, and then you could retype over it with the new letter, and the correct letter you intended. And if you think of that and then apply it to genes, we can now change single nucleotides in different organisms. And so you may have heard of CRISPR-Cas9 system. This is the Tal's effector protein, and we also have zinc finger proteins. And all of these are technologies that are just leaping and bounding right now, and it's very exciting for people in any kind of medical or agricultural research, because we can really do some great things. We'll be able to cure people who are born with genetic defects. We can design new crops that will be amazing, and amazingly enough, these are not considered to be GMOs right now. So it's really got the green light for a lot of scientists, because they feel that they're not going to be hindered in the future moving forward with this work. That said, there's a bit of concern by some of us that people might feel, eventually the general public might feel that underhanded things are going on. So I think this whole range of science has to be tread with very carefully. So now I'm going to give you some examples of GM crops, and I'm going to focus on some of the biotic stresses, which are insects and microbes and fungal, bacterial, virus, pests, and abiotic stresses such as drought, salinity, and high temperatures, frost. And then I'll talk a little bit about biofortified crops and nutritionally enhanced crops and even plant-made pharmaceuticals. So these are some of the examples. I started off with glyphosate because I think, or glyphosate tolerance in plants, because I think this is probably the most popular one in the world right now. It's probably over 50% of GM crops that you hear about probably contain this trait. And glyphosate is a herbicide that's been in use for a while. It was around long before there was a transgenic crop ever produced for it. And it actually is it's a small molecule that will bind to an enzyme in a plant, and the plant is no longer able to make certain amino acids, and the plant eventually withers and dies. And now there are transgenic plants which can have had some small changes made in that enzyme so that the glyphosate molecule can no longer bind and prevent it from making amino acids. So this is an example of a field that has been sprayed with glyphosate. These are transgenic crops. This is a field that has not been sprayed with glyphosate, and all the weeds are there. So it's a big time and energy saver for farmers, and has been widely applied. So another one that's very, very popular, this is probably the second most popular type of GM trait you've probably heard about, is BT. So it's a Bacillus thuringiensis. And these are, this is a toxin that bacteria, comes from a bacteria. It's eaten by the insect, and the insect has an alkaline gut. We have an acidic gut, so it's not going to bother us, but it does bother insects. The toxin becomes activated under alkaline conditions, and it creates havoc in the gut. It makes, I think, holes, and the insect is prone to infection and I guess can starve as well, and it kills bugs. And actually, organic farmers have used BT for a long, long time. I guess the difference here would be a farmer would spray this around, and target plus non-target insects would be affected by BT if you spray it. If you have it in the plant, only the pest that's biting the plant and trying to eat the plant is going to be affected. So this has been widely adopted around here, but I think it's very interesting to see the impact it can have on the rural poor in places like Africa. So here, this is Aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is a terrible toxin that's produced from, I think it's a yeast, a fungus. And insects chew on the corn in the fields, and the fungus is able to get into the bits of corn where the insects chew. And it produces a toxin that causes all kinds of problems. So, cancer, liver disease, growth retardation, all kinds of awful things happen because of aflatoxin. We don't really get aflatoxin much here anymore because we have nice, clean, dry silos, and the way we farm is it's a very aseptic, I suppose. But they don't have the same storage facilities. They don't have the same conditions we have, and their corn can rot. They have difficulties handling their crops. And sometimes they'll say, okay, this corn is too damaged, I'm not going to eat it, I'm going to feed it to my livestock. Well, the aflatoxin will be in the milk and in the meat of their livestock, so they'll still get the aflatoxin. And even if they decide, well, this is too bad for everybody, we're going to use this as fuel, we'll just burn it on our fires, the aflatoxin is still there being passed on to their hands as they're managing their fire sources. So it's just a terrible thing, and BT can be a real savior to people in third world countries. Here are some other types of corn or maize that have been made. So we have biofortified with different minerals and vitamins, and this orange color is because this is vitamin A maize. It has beta-carotene and can supply vitamin A to people. You've probably heard of BT cotton. So again, we're back on BT cotton and BT Brinjal. So here's when BT cotton was introduced in India, and you can see that it was just rapidly adopted, and almost all cotton produced in India right now is from BT cotton. And this shows illegal BT cotton because people were so excited about it, they started to cross it into their own land races and produce their own BT cotton. So it became very, very popular very quickly in India. Meanwhile, we have BT Brinjal. BT Brinjal has been banned right now in India. I think there'd be a number of reasons why, but BT cotton is a cash crop, and farmers, they can make money, and it's very attractive and this sort of thing. BT Brinjal is what subsistent farmers live on. They don't have a lot of money. They're not trading off or involved in international trade. They're just trying to feed their families, and they don't have quite the same voice as the cash crop farmers do. And so BT Brinjal is now in Bangladesh, and we'll probably find it making its way over to India eventually by hook or by crook. Brinjal, so eggplant, it's terrible the way they have to apply insecticides. Like, I'm hearing stories about 20, 30 times a day applying insecticides to eggplant in India and Bangladesh. And even I've heard stories of children going and dipping each eggplant into a bucket of pesticides. Can you imagine? It's just like totally full of pesticides, and that's how bad it is with attacks by insects. So it's really, it's a center of controversy, but it can help farmers so much to have Bt Brinjal. And then for those of you who didn't know, all of our banana, the whole banana industry is in peril. I think 400 million people use bananas as their staple, bananas and plantain around the world. So besides us who just like to eat bananas, there's plenty of people who depend on bananas as their main source of food. And so here we have a fungus that's attacking banana. This is somebody spraying pesticides once again, and it's not very nice. And now we have transgenic bananas, which are slowly coming along, and people may not like a GM banana, but they may not have much choice in the next few years unless we think of some other fabulous idea, because there really isn't a way to treat this fungus besides using a GM technology right now. Part of the reason I've asked the fungus researchers at Cornell, and they said it just, banana, it's so far away, and the United States doesn't think about this as something they should be concerned about. And fungus, it's complicated to work with fungi. They're not so simple. So it's there's a couple of setbacks right there. So we're kind of behind in our research, and this is our best bet right now to providing bananas in the future. And in a similar vein, we have a problem with oranges. I think 70% of oranges that you eat today come from Florida, and we have a terrible disease, citrus greening disease, and it's taking over. So in the next little while, we're destined to lose all of our orange crop because we don't have a good solution. And again, there's a GM solution. There's several different versions of GM solution that could save us or save the crop for now. I've heard rumors of other ways that oranges can be saved, but they're way, way far back in the research and development stages, and they're not going to be around. The oranges won't last before these technologies ever come out. So this may be, one of our only hopes for providing oranges in the future. Okay, so cassava is a staple crop. I think 40 million or 40% of sub-Saharan Africans depend on cassava, but it also has its problems. So this is a Gemini virus. I added this because I thought it might be hard for people who aren't used to viruses to know what the heck I'm showing here. But they're kind of like twinned virus particles. And this is a cassava plant that's infected with a Gemini virus. And so we've now made lines of cassava that are resistant to the virus. And this would be, again, an RNA interference type of technology. And similarly, we have GM cassava. So these are cassavas that now have vitamin A added. And so this is helping to supplement diets of people in rural communities. So wheat stem rust disease, this is a big concern at Cornell University. We have a whole initiative working on this, and I think 30 different countries are involved. But wheat stem rust, I think wheat is one of the three major staples in the world when people eat: wheat, rice, and maize, corn. So it came from Africa. I think this is Uganda, UG99. This is a strain of disease, and it made its way over through the Middle East, and it's heading out to India and on to China, and some of it, I believe, has made its way into South America. And every time we try to make a plant resistant to it just by crossing in a conventional manner, we're unable to. The fungus actually mutates, and it's able to take over again, and it's no longer the plant no longer has resistance. So this is the genome of wheat, and you can see they've mapped out all the different resistance genes, and they finally decided we'll never in time make a a plant in a conventional manner, or even using that marker-assisted selection I showed you before, will never make a plant that will be truly resistant to this fungus. And we're going to have to go the GM way. So that is, in fact, what they're doing. They're stacking all of these traits. They're taking all of these resistance genes and stacking them in one genetic cassette, and they're producing this in wheat. And this may be the way to save wheat for the planet, because we don't have a way other than this right now. So that's, it's serious. Okay, now for abiotic stresses, we have rice that is now tolerant to both drought and flooding conditions, so submersive conditions here. These pictures come from the International Rice Institute. And we have what we call climate-ready maize. This is corn that can handle all kinds of different stresses. So this enables the rural poor to become resilient to what we call climate shocks. So when the world becomes unpredictable in terms of whether they get a drought, this year, and waterlog the next year, these are varieties that can be used to help them and keep them from falling under and slipping into poverty or starvation. They'll have varieties available that they'll be able to work with. This is a slide from Kevin Folta, who's at University of Florida. So golden rice is a really good one. I have a few slides on it because I think it's a pretty well presented example. So here's vitamin A deficiency across the world. We have up to 500,000 children go blind each year, and half of these will die within a year of losing their sight. Vitamin A deficiency is a real problem. There's plenty of vitamin A deficiency in India, for example. I was hearing just last week. And it's not so easy to just send people supplements. Sometimes you can give people supplements, and then as soon as the donor who's providing this stops, that's it, you lose your supplement. So it's very hard for people in rural communities to manage if they don't have a varied diet and they're very poor. So this is, making the golden rice is one way to handle this. These slides actually come from the Golden Rice Institute. They sent me all their slides a couple of years ago because I was writing a book and they wanted to give me what they had. So here's what they did. They worked with a biotech company to produce golden rice. As you can see here, it's producing beta-carotene. And then they went ahead and bred them into different varieties that different groups would like to use, such as the Philippines, Bangladesh, and Asia. And then they wanted to test to see how well this worked. And I think this is quite nice from a scientific standpoint. They used heavy water, so they used a stable isotope. This isn't an isotope that degrades and gives off radiation. It's just stable. And they fed the plants. They had heavy water in with the plants, and the roots of the plants took up the heavy water and put the heavy water into their beta-carotene. So they could actually trace the beta-carotene. They then were able to feed this to people in a clinical trial, and they could follow the heavy water marked beta-carotene and watch it be converted into vitamin A in these people. So they could show that they could get good high levels of vitamin A made in people, and they could tell you that that vitamin A came exactly from that rice. So they were very satisfied with that. Then they went ahead and they did a study with children in China, and they were able to show that golden rice worked better than even conventional spinach at providing vitamin A, and at least as good as a capsule of vitamin A. So the bad news is the Chinese government got very upset, and there was a big rigmarole, and in fact the paper was retracted, and the researcher, who was a Chinese person from Tufts University here in the States, actually retired and closed her lab because there was so much commotion about testing rice on children, and they thought some people thought this was a terrible thing, and already it had looked like a wonderful thing, really. So here's just showing you how cost-effective supplementation costs versus golden rice. So it's just, so much less expensive to do things this way. It's feasible. It's the rice is not going to wreak havoc through food systems because you can see it. It's golden. It looks different than everything else. And there's no strings attached in terms of intellectual property because it's all philanthropic. It's made by a philanthropic group, and it's sitting there stalled and going nowhere right now. So there we go. That's the golden rice story. So we'll just whip through a few more of these. Here's a genetically modified carrot that they've enhanced a calcium transporter so that the carrot can produce more calcium, and people can eat this or use the same carrot calcium transporter in lettuce or potatoes and be provided with more calcium in their diets. And here's a tomato. There's a clinical trial going on right now in Canada, but the work comes from Great Britain. And again, the British didn't want that clinical trial going on in their country, so it came over to Canada. And so these are tomatoes. They're producing the same bioactive compounds that blueberries produce. And so, why would we make blueberry-like tomatoes? Well, blueberries aren't so available to everybody, but tomatoes are a lot more available. It's a lot more feasible for farmers to grow these or to manage. So this is something they've shown that it actually can reduce the risk of cancer in mice, and they're now doing a clinical trial in humans to see how that works. Okay, and these are soybeans that are producing omega-3. Right now, we don't have enough fish, I believe, for the human population, or it's certainly, if we don't have enough, we're at precipitous levels of fish in our oceans for feeding the world. And we need omega-3 fatty acids to be healthy. And so this is a way, again, of producing it in fields. It's made in plants, but it's from marine creatures. And this can help supplement people's diets. We also have plant-made vaccines and monoclonal antibodies. And I've just listed a few here. We can produce vaccines against some of the major killers of children in third world countries in plants. So the person can eat the plant or a modified version of the fruit of the plant. For example, a tomato that's been dried up and made into a paste or a juice. They can drink that and become immunized against a number of different infectious diseases. So this is another up-and-coming technology. And this is just showing you, again, we can even put this is an epitope, the yellow. It's the vaccine protein on the surface of plant virus particles and infect plants, and then collect these particles, and your body will recognize this. Your immune system really likes a nice regular pattern of an immunogen, such as on the surface of a virus particle, and you'll make an immune response. And so this can work for people, it can work for animals. This has been licensed for poultry. And you may not realize this, but a plant-made monoclonal antibody was used to treat some of those patients who were exposed to Ebola last year. So this is a company, MAP Biopharmaceutical, and they made I think it's in tobacco. They produced a Ebola vaccine that they hadn't really had a chance to test. So it was an experimental vaccine. Several people were dying of Ebola, and they tried it out on these people, and some people lived. So maybe it helped, and one person died. So certainly this is an easy way, inexpensive and easy way to provide people with treatments, pharmaceutical treatments. So in summary for this section, we've talked about some of the ways that agricultural biotechnology can help assist in food security, and certainly can help farmers a lot. That's what a lot of the initial traits were about. We can improve yields and human health clearly. We can reduce tillage and use our land more effectively, maybe use less land than we have used previously to grow crops. So is it the answer, though? Well, it's an answer. It's one of many answers that will be needed to combat the challenge of food security. So there are a lot of other innovations that are required as well, and I've listed some of them here. So, again, in Africa, we certainly need better roads. They have to deal with waste in their fields better. They just let crops rot because they can't get them to market because they don't have very good roads. They need better use of water, better ways to store their harvests, more infrastructure. There are many farmers in Africa. Most farmers, I would say, are women, and there are still gender issues that have to be addressed. Certainly improve farming methods, and of course they need fewer civil wars and different conflicts. And then I've put here in bold, certainly making digital information available. I'm calling it knowledge-intensive technology, but I think this is going to be a real winner for people in the third world. And so it's not exactly anything to do with genetically modified plants, but it's very interesting and exciting. So here, state-of-the-art agriculture in the U.S. today, we use something called precision agriculture, where satellites are able to take pictures of farmers' fields. And here we've got a map of fields and crop stress versus water deficit versus vegetation density. And farmers are able to look at the data and figure out what's going on in their fields. And in fact, at Cornell, I'm hearing these rumors about drones now being developed that will go out into farmers' fields, these big, large fields you see, and being able to test farmers' fields for pest pressure or need for water or what have you. So that actually may be coming along in the next few years. And on the same vein, in terms of developing countries, we had someone come from NASA and speak to us, and they're using satellites to analyze crop growth. So they're able to, from the initial onset of when crops are planted in developing countries, they can watch by the wavelength. They'll know exactly what wavelength to use for which plant. They can watch the rate of photosynthesis. They can see whether a plant is under stress. They can predict. They have an algorithm. They can predict with 6 months before a food price hike that it's going to happen. They can tell farmers right away, you've got a problem. Your crop is not going to be as successful as you think, and we can see it from our satellite. And people can react. They can do things. So these are really important global technologies. And here's one more, and this one is more of kind of a Facebook type of technology, but all of these farmers, this is a network we have that's affiliated with Cornell. All of these technologies, or all of these farmers can use a smartphone. They can plug in their own data of what they're seeing in their fields. They can talk to other farmers. A lot of these farms are in interesting microclimates where you have high elevations and low elevations, and farmers are quite isolated from each other. They've never had the opportunity to speak with each other, and someone 100 miles away might be facing exactly the same problem that you're facing on your piece of farmland. And now they can talk and they can work and they can communicate, and they can communicate with people even in India or far away places and talk about this and that. And now they're able to really make a difference. And they this particular group set these farmers up, and within 2 years their crop yields increased 5 times. And that had nothing to do with adding any GMOs. They were just using their regular crops. They were learning how to work with each other. They were communicating. And look at what a success they had. So there's lots of room for improvement for poor rural farmers. And then finally, meanwhile at the university, we have all these fancy technologies which we're using, proteomics, metabolomics, transcriptomics, and we'll continue to be able to design and improve crops for years to come. Okay, I have a few minutes left, so I'm going to make a dash for it, and I'm going to talk about public perception, policy, and international trade. And I'll say right now, clearly I'm a person who likes GM crops, and maybe some of you don't. So let's just be nice with each other. We won't have some kind of shouting banter or anything like this. But I'm giving you the viewpoint of a scientist, so this is what you're getting. Okay, so what do scientists think about farming? This is what, when we're talking to each other, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about drought. We're talking about flooding. We're talking about frozen apples that didn't, or apple trees that didn't get to blossom, and no apples came out in New York State a few years ago. We're talking about insect infestation. We're talking about all kinds of problems, and they're serious problems. They're very serious problems. Here's what it appears to scientists that some of the general public think about farming. So here we have, this is Beatrix Potter. I don't know if any of you know this, but it's sort of a children's story. It's lush and green, and the worst thing that's going to happen in Beatrix Potter is Mr. McGregor, the farmer, is going to come by and chase Peter Rabbit. And meanwhile, here's Squirrel Nutkin and Jemima Puddle Duck. And also we have Old MacDonald had a farm, and everybody is smiling, and the sun is shining, and things are great. And isn't this just fabulous that the world is just so great? So it seems too idealistic to us. We're seeing the ugly side, and we've got challenges, and we've got to fight. And it's quite a schism in the way sometimes people think. And so here I've gone a little further. I'm talking about food sovereigntists. A food sovereignist is somebody, I would say, who thinks, I can only eat local, or I can only eat organic, or I can only eat what have you. And they've got very specified, perception of what food is that is nutritious. And, this looks really nice. But what about this person? This is not necessarily what is going on in the world. What was going on in this picture is going on for a very small number of people, really. And this is more like what's going on in the rest of the world. So it's a nice story, and yes, I think you should have the option of buying what you want and doing what you like to do with food, of course. Everyone should. But we still have to keep this in mind, and this is a big deal. So we had, years ago, in the 1950s and 60s, we had something known as the Green Revolution. And this is Norman Borlaug. He was the guy who really initiated the Green Revolution. He won the Nobel Prize for this reason. And he was able to design, he was a plant breeder, he was able to design plants, wheat, that could increase in yield. So here's the results of the Green Revolution. You can see in these countries an enormous amount of increase in yield for grain exporters. So it turned around. When I was a kid, I was hearing stories about, the starving people are going to starve in India, you better eat your vegetables. And nowadays, India is like a powerhouse. They've got all kinds of grain, and they're an exporter now. So things did turn around because of the Green Revolution. So that's one nice thing to say. And nowadays we have the gene revolution. So here I'm talking about biotechnology, and here is the impact. So again, you see here's the number of crops that are being, total hectares of crops that are developed using GM technologies. And here's industrial countries here, but look, the developing countries have overcome us. So more developing countries use GM technologies nowadays than industrial countries. Now, the US and the EU differ in how they manage to regulate genetically modified crops. And why is this? Well, the United States uses a policy of substantial equivalence. So they feel that if a trait is more or less the same as something that is in a GM crop as in a conventional crop, there's no additional risk. So they're not very excited. For example, would a BT crop fall under substantial equivalence? I think probably so. Would a golden rice fall under substantial equivalence? I'm not sure if it would, because you've added a new trait. There's nothing out there like it. So I don't know if that would really fall under that category. So the Europeans, on the other hand, they use the precautionary principle. So in this case, they feel that anything that's kind of funky with plants and genes, what have you, that's it. It's inefficient evidence. I don't care that there's a trillion meals being that have been eaten with GM crops. It's still not safe enough for us. The evidence isn't there, and even though there's tens of thousands of papers that have been published showing that they're safe, it's not going to work for us. So here is how Americans or the U.S. Regulate transgenic crops. They use 3 different regulatory bodies that were already in place, so they just work with them in a coordinated framework. So we have the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA. An example would be a plant-made pharmaceutical like what I make. I usually use a bioreactor in a lab, so I'm guessing the EPA would not be needed for me. If we had a forest, a transgenic chestnut tree, you're not going to eat the tree, so I'm guessing the FDA would not be used. In that case, the other 2 would be used for regulation. If we had, again, something like golden rice and it's going to be out in the field and it's something that people eat, I think all 3 have to be involved. So that's the way it kind of works in the U.S. Meanwhile, in Europe, they had a moratorium in the 1990s about using GMOs. And just recently, I'm afraid I forgot to put the date here, but this was from January 2015. They're still in a deadlock. They're not going to allow GM crops to be grown. And it gets very frustrating because the Europeans import GM grain for their livestock. So they won't grow it, but they'll buy it and feed their own cattle GM grain. So here are some issues because of these differences that come along concerning international trade. At the bottom, I've mentioned the EU and the US have such different policies that it makes kind of a mess for everybody else. It makes it difficult for everyone to work together. At the top, I've got asynchronous regulatory approvals. This is a serious problem because the US is kind of advanced in biotechnology and other countries aren't as advanced. So they're behind in their rules and regulations. So we might have a crop approved for distribution, but China may not be there yet. They may be several years behind. So we can't trade with certain countries as well as we'd like because of this asynchrony. We also have a low-level presence of GM products sometimes that are acceptable here. It might be 0.9% GM contamination here, but might be a problem in another country. So Europe or somebody will turn the ship back containing the grain because they found a teensy-weensy amount of GM contamination, and it's acceptable here but not there. So there are issues that come up that have to really be addressed. And they are being addressed, and right now, actually this Friday of all times, we have a whole new modernization of the regulatory system for biotechnology products. And some folks from Cornell are, I think, going out there to D.C. to sit and talk about what can be done to make things work better. So, and now I'll spend 2 minutes, I'll go really quick, on some of the food transnational movement politics and food security. So we have thought leaders and cultural brokers. These are some of the folks who you might hear about, and they seem to catch the eye of individuals and get their attention. You know, Vandana Shiva is very, very popular. she's quite crafty. She's very clever, the way she puts things together. I've put a picture of tree huggers because she was one of the original tree huggers in India. These are people who are, save our forests. We're going to stand and hold this tree, and you can't stop us. You can't log here. And that caught on all over the world. And so she's famous for that, and she goes on with her ideas about conservation and environmentalism. And I put here are some folks, I hate to tell them, but these guys who are so against Monsanto, I don't know anybody who wears these white suits. Certainly I've never worn a suit like this, and I think that if they're buying other seeds, such as organic seeds, I think they probably came from Monsanto too, or from one of these other major multinational companies, because that's where most seeds come from. So I'd be very surprised if they could prove that they didn't go to a large company to get their seeds. And of course I put David and Goliath because these movement politics, they kind of frame it so that we're David and the company is Goliath, and Monsanto is the Death Star. I added that because we've heard that before. So why are we mad? Here we have all these people. Where does that lady, that poor African lady with bare feet who's hoeing her fields, where does she fit into all of this? And I don't know where, but it can't be good. And where do I fit into this? Because I don't work for Monsanto. I'm a publicly funded scientist, and there's plenty of people just like me, and we just work for universities or research institutes, and we don't see where we fit in. So we get mad because the regulatory environment is too restrictive for people at universities to see anything happen. A lot of our innovations end up shelves. They're in cold rooms, in seeds, on shelves, and we can't move ahead. So we're frustrated, and maybe I should stop there. Okay. All right. So thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for some questions. Yeah.
I have a question about the precautionary that you talked about. So what would you say about cases in which, like, a drug like Brinjal was approved by the FDA and, said to be totally safe, and then in retrospect they found that it actually had really harmful effects? Maybe the precautionary principle could have prevented that from.
I'm not familiar with that drug. The FDA, I think, sometimes may make mistakes. It's true. I'm not so familiar with medicines and drugs, so I'm not. It would be hard for me to really say.
So I guess just like the idea of that principle and disregarding taking the extra step to be a little bit more safe to prevent something from coming through that shouldn't be.
Oh, I don't mind the extra steps. No, we don't mind that at all. But these are crops, and that's. I don't know if the EU uses a precautionary principle on drugs and medicine. It's a really good question. I don't know the answer. Sorry.
How does a plant-based pharmaceutical differ from an herbal supplement or a dietary supplement?
Oh, yeah. So herbal supplements are not necessarily some facet of biotechnology, though they can be. I should be careful what I say here. These are bioactive compounds which you can isolate from plants or other organisms. And I think the issue there is a lot of them are not FDA approved, so we don't really know what we've got. Though that is the source of new medicines and drugs a lot of the time. We use the scaffold, the molecular scaffold of bioactive compounds found in different species for drug discovery. So they're important. A plant-made pharmaceutical is we took a plant, we used biotechnology to produce a known vaccine product that we designed in there. So we designed the product that the plant produces. You're talking about something that the plant may have originally had already. Yeah.
I'm just curious if there
Yeah. Oh, for risk, or because people got tired of fighting.
Yeah, like something, like that was not anticipated, but then turned out to be, like somehow like not really as beneficial or, or harmful or anything. Like, was there any specific case?
There was a case years ago where some kind of nut product was produced in a plant and it had allergenicity. They found it right away and they ditched it. So that was a GM product that never made itself, never advanced because they found an allergenicity problem with it. But you can also have problems like this with conventional crops. You can cross plants and one will cause problems for people. So it's not isolated to a genetically modified crop. Yeah.
So GMOs have been around for actually quite a while now.
Yes.
Is the negative or the fear of GMO in the food chain decreasing at all, or is it able to be maintained at the... I mean, you can understand it when it first came out, we don't know what's going to happen,
Yeah.
blah, 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 but
Yeah, I
it's been
had
quite a while.
quite a bit more here, but I just go to this. This is like a poll. I think people haven't made their minds up. This is, social scientists are telling me this means that people don't know. They really don't know. They're being bombarded. If you type in Google and GMO, all kinds of negative stuff comes out. But if you talk to government people and scientists, they don't necessarily say negative things. So I think they're trying to figure it out, and it's really hard to say. I think the government is going to keep going on with it, though. I think they're going to soldier through, and the plan is to iron out these regulatory problems and make it, learn from their mistakes so that it's not so scary for people. Yeah.
I have comments and questions about the Roundup Ready crops. First of all, one of your slides said that it would save pesticide use. In fact, Roundup is used more and more now that you have the Roundup Ready crops. Last year, 185 million tons were used.
Yeah.
Also, plants take up the glyphosate. They do not degrade it. They cannot degrade it. They can extrude some of it, but not all of it. And you mentioned that Europe imports GMO feed for their animals from the United States. Have a paper here, Detection of Glyphosate Residues in Animals and Humans from Germany. Their glyphosate is in the food, the glyphosate is eaten, and the glyphosate is in the animals, and they detect it in humans. And also there's a major effect on the microbiome. Glyphosate-based herbicides reduce the activity and reproduction of earthworms and lead to increased soil nutrient concentrations.
Glyphosate also has a lower LD50 than tobacco, alcohol,
Yes.
and most of the foods that you
Yeah, that would be the first argument, I think. I don't want to fight with you, and I know there's a lot of information out there, and it's very confusing. But glyphosate replaced a far nastier pesticide that was being used. So that's a positive thing.
It is not harmless to the microbiome. It is not harmless to the bacteria in the soil or in your gut.
So the issue with glyphosate, and plants were made to be resistant to it. Glyphosate is a chemical. It's a herbicide, and there are even some crops that are becoming resistant on their own to glyphosate, or insects that are becoming, weeds that are becoming resistant to glyphosate. It's overused. So farmers went wild because it worked so well. They went bananas, spraying it like crazy. And that was even before the first GM crops came along. So now we have to be a lot more restrictive about how we manage things. We're going to have crop rotation. We're going to have to use, as far as herbicides and things like this go, this comes from the Dean of Agriculture at University of Pennsylvania State, I guess, Penn State University, and I'm sure he's no dumb guy. I think he knows his stuff. He's a herbicide guy. He says that don't just sit there thinking that there's just something else out there available for you or for farmers. It's not as if there's another golden product. It's all you can do to keep up with these weeds and these pests. It's not. Don't sit there and think that there's better ways. It's a struggle. It's a real fight and a battle. So that's what I have to say.
So I got a question on the Cas9 and the GRNA. Sorry, this is a little technical. Like, so that just because it's like the last 2-3 years it's come out, we don't know a lot about it. We don't know about like off-target mutations and things like that.
Yes,
Are there
yeah.
regulations in the agriculture industry about using it as a method for genetically modifying crops? I mean, we don't know that much about it, so I'm just curious.
Yes, I think that has to be incorporated into the new regulatory structure, and I think that's their plan and why they're sort of revamping their whole structure. So right now, there are people in labs at universities who are using that system to make mutations in crops, but I don't know of anyone who has taken any of this far enough to commercialize. I think like we're many years behind that. So that we need the regulations, and the public needs to know. They need to be familiar so we don't have a backlash. You know, I think it's important. I think there are some non-target mutations that I've heard of, so things have to be worked on. It's under development. Yeah.
Time for one last question.
This is more of like a political structural question, because I don't know anything about the society, like the sciencey stuff. So this could be totally false, but here's a rumor that went around about some stuff Monsanto was doing. They were genetically modifying seeds in some way that like they would grow, but then farmers were in a sense addicted to they wouldn't continue to grow the crops they were supposed to grow, or the crops they would grow would not produce the sorts of things that farmers could then grow more crops of that kind. This is the story. This could be false, but it's not about the science or the health concerns. What in general, what kind of structure would you as a scientist like to see politically that might make it so that less power is in the hands of companies?
That's like the $1 million question.
Modify
So we need to have some.
That would help them rather than the people.
Yeah, they're like the 800-pound gorilla. We can't fight. We can't keep up with them because we're slowed down. We're slowed down because of public perception concerning GM crops. So the more the public pushes back against them, the more people who have not that much money, or universities, for example, can't move forward. And the only person on the block, the only kid on the block, is Monsanto or Pioneer, and they can just sprint ahead. So that's what's going on. It's like a vicious cycle. And what we need to do is reorganize regulations to make them feasible for small companies or universities to see their products and innovations move forward in such a way that they aren't just completely obliterated by these large companies like Monsanto. So there are a number of possible ways that can happen, and to sort of shunt through technologies that could be useful to people in developing countries, for example, and these are all under negotiation right now. So I'd like to see universities and small companies move forward and Monsanto get pushed to the back. That's what I'd like to see. So,
Let's thank our speaker.